Chapter 6 in our text is entitled God is Person. We have many references in the Bible to God's personhood. One example is here, Psalm 115. Our God is in heaven and does whatever He pleases. They're idols, and this is where you see why this description of God comes out so often. This is in contrast to the idols of peoples around the people of Israel, where people are worshiping things that don't have ears. They have mouths but cannot speak. They have eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear. They have noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel. They have feet but cannot walk. They cannot make a sound with their throats. In contrast, the God of heaven is one who can speak and can see and can hear and can smell. This is a God of personhood who has the traits of personhood. What are those traits? We might, and for these purposes here, we might list a series of things that a true, full person actually has. A true person is unique, is different from other persons, an individual, unlike any other individual. A person is also active. They're vibrant, dynamic. They're moving. They're also intelligent. They're discerning. They can discern one individual from another individual. They're knowing, understanding. A person also has will. They can choose, decide. I'm going to go this way or I'm not going to go this way. They're because of that ability to choose, they're sometimes difficult to predict what they're going to do next. A person has personality, that's the reason, the term personality, which means they have emotions, they have humor, they play. These are characteristics that are unique to persons. Persons also have self-awareness. They know they exist and distinction to other things. They recognize themselves. They recognize themselves in a mirror. That this isn't someone else or this isn't another organism on the other side of the mirror. This is in fact themselves. They enter into relationships with other persons. These are all characteristics of someone who is a full person. God is in fact a person. He's got the characteristics of personhood. He's got all of these 7 characteristics we've just listed. First of all, God is unique. He's unlike any other. Just at a chapter along that line, God is a unique individual, unlike any other. He has no equal. He's infinitely greater than everything that is in the creation, so he's definitely a unique being. Secondly, God is active. He's dynamic. He's vibrant. Look at the verses, look at the verbs that are used in Scripture with respect to him. He sees, he hears, he smells, he tastes, he speaks, he breathes, creates, walks, sits, drives out. He divides, he moves, he places, he rests, he plants, he forms, he rises, he eats, he shuts in, he marks. He's described as all unlimited, almighty, mighty. All of these are words that describe his activity. But God is also intelligent. He's knowing, discerning, understanding. Again, words in Scripture describing God. He remembers. He knows. He has thoughts. He has thoughts about us. He understands the thoughts of others. He's a source of wisdom. Each one of these comments would point to the fact that God is an intelligent being. He's wise. He understands. He's the source of understanding. He has knowledge and he is the source of knowledge. So God is intelligent, but God is also possessive of will. He chooses, he decides. He's difficult to predict sometimes. Scripture indicates he has a will. He changes his will based upon obedience. If a person is obedient, he will change his mind with respect to what he does to them. And according to Scripture, he does whatever he wishes to do, whatever he wills to do. God has will. God also has emotion. The Bible describes him having anger, vengeance, compassion, pleasure, joy, love. He's described as having a heart and a soul. He has grief, pity, favor. He has many emotions. God is a God of emotion. He is self-aware. He recognizes himself when Moses wants to know, what is your name? I'm going to go to these people of Israel and claim I'm going to release them from captivity, or you're going to release them from captivity, but they're going to ask who you are. What is your name? What do I call you? And God's choice on a name is, I am that I am. I mean, that's the ultimate in self-awareness. I am that I am. He refers to himself in first person. For example, we've already referred more than once to Genesis 1:26, when God said, let us make man in our image. He refers to himself. And he's referred to by name, by various names. So the Lord thy God, Jehovah, the God of hosts, and there's so many other names for God. So God is self-aware. He also enters into relationship. In particular, he enters into relationship with humans. And we have lots of verbs in Scripture that describe this. He responds, and again, this is God relating to human. He responds to humans. He helps humans. He heals humans, comforts them, blesses them, curses them, destroys them. He doesn't. He chooses not to destroy them. He wipes away their tears. He counsels them. He teaches them. He guides them. He leads them. He witnesses to them. He redeems them. He intercedes for them. He advocates for them. God does not lie to humans. He does good to humans. He judges with grace with humans. He judges with justice. He judges with mercy. He is kind to humans. He's gentle and patient and faithful with humans. He's faithful with a steadfast love. He dwells among men. He speaks with humans. He walks with humans. He renames humans. They come with one name. He gives another name when they change relationship with him. He knows humans by name. He covenants with humans. He communes with humans. He develops friendships with humans. And believers can even call him Papa. God also enters into relationship with humans. He is described in the Bible as a man of war, a farmer, a builder, a potter, a father, a husband, a bridegroom, a shepherd. So God has all these attributes of personhood. He's unique, he's active, he's intelligent, he has will, he has emotion, he's self-aware. He enters into relationship, in this case with humans. God is a person. But his personhood, like every other aspect of God, of course, is invisible. It's something that cannot be perceived. God desires us, however, to be able to perceive that invisible personhood of himself. And so he has chosen to illustrate his invisible personhood by putting examples of the traits of personhood into organisms, in particular, mostly into animals. In fact, he's created a spectrum of perfection of each of the traits and scattered them through the organisms that he created. So God is unique. He put a spectrum of creation, a spectrum of perfection, of uniqueness into those things that he made, into the organisms on the planet. God is active. So for us to see his activity, to understand it, he put activity into all the organisms of the planet. God is intelligent. So to picture that, he put a spectrum of perfection of intelligence into animals that we find on the planet. God has will, and he's chosen then to put a spectrum of perfection of will into organisms, in particular in animals, so that we can understand the will of God. God has emotion. He's put a spectrum of perfection of emotion into some of the animals anyway. He has put a spectrum of perfection of self-awareness into animals as a picture of the self-awareness of God himself. God enters into relationships. He has also created organisms that enter into various and sundry relationships. These things, these truths, this the spectra of perfection that are found in organisms are illustrative of the very nature of God. What we're going to do over the next few lessons is go through each of these. We're going to go through first the spectrum of perfection of uniqueness in organisms and show how that shows the uniqueness of God. And then we're going to move into the activity of organisms. It's going to take us quite a while because God has actually put evidence of his personhood in abundance in organisms. And it's also pretty cool to look at the organisms and how they do in fact illustrate the very personhood of God. As we begin our examination of the spectra of perfection of personhood that God has placed among organisms, we're going to begin with the spectrum of perfection of uniqueness among organisms that in fact is evidence of God's uniqueness, his personal uniqueness. Actually, we've already dealt with this in part in a previous chapter. We dealt with discontinuity, the discontinuity between species, the discontinuity between genera, the discontinuity between created kinds, the discontinuity between greater and among greater groups. This increasing amount of discontinuity, a spectrum of perfection of these things, points to the infinite uniqueness, discontinuity of God with everything else. We also see that he's placed discontinuity among and between individuals. We didn't talk about this very much, so we'll talk a little bit about that here. There's even between extremely similar organisms that you and I wouldn't be able to tell the difference when we see them. We see two bacteria, they look to be identical. If we look at their DNA even, they have identical DNA, yet there are distinctions among them, but they seem to be at a scale that's almost too fine for us to see. There are those organisms that are really, really, really similar, and then there are organisms that are a little bit more different from each other in species. For example, we have clones of organisms. Within a species, we'll have clones. The examples of this would be if you take a cutting from a plant, if you take the leaf off of a plant, stick the leaf into water, the leaf will eventually, almost in all cases, root. And you can then put that plant, that leaf, with the roots into soil, and it'll grow into a plant. That new plant will have the same DNA as the plant from which the cutting was taken. Those two plants are identical in their DNA. Now what's interesting is even though they are identical in their DNA, they will not have the same branching pattern. So they're identical at a very high level, but there are still differences among them and between them. We also have organisms that differ as individuals in sexual organisms. Bacteria don't, we're going to see this in a later chapter, bacteria don't use sexual activity to in fact reproduce. They divide and produce exact copies of themselves, and that's not the same as, for example, humans and pine trees and lions and tigers and all of those sorts of things. All of those organisms, the organisms we're most familiar with, the organisms we can see, that are big enough to see, they reproduce by sex. They actually combine information from the male and the female, and produce an offspring. What is combined, and we're going to see this quite dramatically in a future chapter, is what is combined from each of the parents is different from what's contributed by the mother is different from the DNA of the mother herself. And we're going to see that what is contributed by the male is different DNA from what is in the male. The combination of the two produces in the offspring, in the one that results, a radically different DNA from either parent, a type of DNA that's never been seen before. These would be the case, this is the case for most sexual organisms. In other words, for humans, every human being that is born that is not an identical twin has unique DNA that's never been seen before in the history of humanity. For example, in humans, we estimate there's 10 to the 600th different types or different combinations of DNA that are possible. That is a huge number, 10 to the 600th power. So 1 followed by 600 zeros. That's a really, really big number. The chance of two people, let's say a man and a woman get married and they have 2 children, the chances that those 2 children would end up with the same DNA as each other would be 1 chance in 10 to the 600th power. That is basically impossible. In fact, if you were to take the size of the universe, which is 10 billion light years in radius, takes light traveling at 386,000 miles per second, an estimated 10 billion years just to cross 1/2 of the universe. If you take that whole universe and pack into it as many humans as you could possibly pack in there so that it filled up the universe with no space in between, you'd still only have 10 to the 120th power humans. And if you had 1,000 universes, you would only have 10 to the 123rd humans. If you had 1 billion universes, you would have only 10 to the 129th humans in the universe. You can't get up to this number 10 to the 600th power. It is basically impossible for 2 people to be born with the same DNA. This is why DNA fingerprinting can be so effective, because there's no possible way, unless they're identical twins, which we'll talk about later, is due to a single fertilization event. Unless it's identical twins, 2 human beings will never have the same DNA. That means that God has created things in such a way that when humans have offspring, they're different from their parents. When rabbits have young, every rabbit is different from every other rabbit and different from their parents. When a blade of grass, when grass reproduces and produces more grass, those new grass plants have radically different DNA that no other grass plant has ever had before. So there's uniqueness at the level of individuals, even within species. And of course, as humans, we don't usually find a whole lot of trouble differentiating between individuals of the same species. 2 humans, we can usually tell, oh, they're different from each other. And that's true of organisms as well. For example, elephants can recognize different elephants. I suspect you and I would have a tremendous amount of difficulty telling the difference between 2 elephants, but apparently elephants have no trouble telling the difference between elephants. In fact, elephants can easily recognize 200 different individuals. Each elephant can recognize 200 different elephants as distinct from themselves and from other elephants. Vervet monkeys, for example, have there's experiments that have been done, kind of cruel, I guess you'd say in a way. They've taped the distress call of baby vervet monkeys. And then they've played that distress call when the little infant isn't actually in distress. Not only does the mother look up and look towards the distress call, recognizing the particular call of her offspring, but in a vervet monkey troop, all the other females, all the other mothers, will look at her, waiting for her to respond to her infant's call. So not only does each vervet monkey mother recognize her own infant, but every other vervet monkey mother recognizes which mother each infant call goes to. That's pretty amazing. They have this ability to differentiate individuals. Individuals are different, and they can recognize those differences. One of my favorite examples in another group, there's some large octopi that live off of the coast of Washington that are being studied by a marine biologist, focusing on the study of those particular octopi. And this marine biologist, in order to visit the octopi, and that's what she does, she dives in the water and goes around and visits the various dens that the octopi occupy. And when she does so, of course, she has to don a scuba diving gear. Well, you know about scuba diving gear. It looks the same from one individual to another. You cover up the identity of a human being. It's really difficult to identify another human being when they're in a scuba outfit. It turns out that these octopi that are generally very skittish and disappear as soon as a human being show up have become used to her. They will not slide back into their den when she shows up. They remain in place as she works around with them and does whatever she does with them. If someone else, however, wearing the very same outfit, the very same scuba gear material, and being of the same body shape and everything, comes to that same location, the octopi disappear. They are able even to recognize individuals of other species. So God has created uniqueness in individuals, filled the biological world with uniqueness, and has even created the ability to distinguish among and between individuals within species. And there's, again, a spectrum of perfection of uniqueness, from individuals to species to created kinds to higher groups, that point to the uniqueness of God. Second of all, God has shown his own activity, which cannot be seen, by creating evidence of activity in organisms. He's created a variety of types of activity in organisms to show, in fact, God's own activity. Now, this is a huge category. I'm going to spend a lot of time going through examples of organisms created with various types of activity. Again, though, keep in mind, or try to keep in mind, that all these examples are showing us illustrations of the activity, the infinite activity of God. Now, some organisms don't seem to move around too much. They don't look very active. We see, for example, let's say an oyster sitting on a rock. Doesn't seem to move. It doesn't move at all. It's sedentary. In fact, it's often cemented to the rock. In that organism, or in a tree that it doesn't wave its branches. Maybe the wind might move its branches, but it doesn't seem to move at all in the course of its life. If you look more closely, even at the organisms that don't seem to move, you will find that there's a tremendous amount of activity occurring inside their cells. Inside their cells, there's something called metabolism going on all the time. We're going to devote an entire chapter to the study of metabolism later on, but for our purposes now, all you need to know is metabolism is the activity inside organisms that produces the food that they need, the energy that they need, everything that they need to live is being processed in something kind of like machinery inside the organisms. And that working machinery that's going on all the time at a microscopic level is called metabolism. Every organism on the planet has metabolism going on, even if it looks like from the outside the organism isn't moving at all. Metabolism is always going on. Organisms are always building new molecules for life. They're breaking down molecules that have been damaged. They are burning sources of energy and getting energy out of those things. That's going on all the time. Besides metabolism that's going on, almost all organisms undergo some sort of growth. They grow, they change. It might take a while. We might have to watch a long time for a tree to actually change size. But in the course of time, virtually every organism, even most of the single-celled organisms, grow during a portion of their life. In the case of one-celled organisms, where the whole organism is just a single cell and it's microscopic, very, very tiny, even in those cases, the organism grows by that individual cell growing. When it first comes into being, it's often because one cell divided into two. But in dividing into two, the two cells are now smaller than the original cell, and they have to grow up to the size of the original cell to be an adult form of that organism. So even one-celled organisms grow by increasing their cell size. Larger organisms, like ourselves, start out individual one-celled organisms. And then those cells divide into two cells into four into eight, and so on until we get trillions of cells. We grow by adding cells. But no matter what the organism is, whether it's a single-celled organism or a multi-celled organism, organisms change size at some point in their life, and therefore they are active in growth. There's also a process of what we call development, which refers to basically an organism growing up from babyhood to adulthood, from its origin to its full, complete size. Again, as I said, one-celled organisms increase in size as they grow up, as they develop. They also increase in number of cell components. We're going to look later in a future chapter at the organelles of the cell, the components of a cell. When a cell is first generated by splitting of one cell, it'll have half as many components as the final cell should have. So the components are duplicated and the number of components are increased as the cell increases in size. Organisms that are made of more than one cell, as I said, they start with a single cell, but they add cells and they grow in the process of development in that fashion. When you get to more complex organisms, growth involves more than just adding cells. You also have to add organs. Like as we grow, we start out a single cell. We don't have a heart. We don't have lungs. We don't need it at that tiny, tiny one-celled stage. But as we grow bigger, we're going to need more and more organs to supply the needs of the rest of the body. So in our development, we, at one point in our development in the womb of our mother, produce such things as a heart. We generate a lung, a second lung, we produce kidneys, and we produce all those internal organs that are necessary for us to live. And that occurs during this process of development. There are some organisms that in developing, they start out looking like basically miniatures of their adult form. They grow by what we call direct development. They sort of start out miniature forms of the adults and just get bigger and bigger and bigger all through their life. Other organisms undertake or undergo indirect development. They start out looking very different than their parents. For example, tadpoles don't look a whole lot like the frogs that they ultimately develop into. So frogs develop first through a process, through a stage that looks very different from the adult, and then metamorphose into the adult form. Butterflies and moths start out in caterpillar form, growing in caterpillar size, and then go into pupa stage and come out a radically different adult form than they were as young. And that's an example of indirect development, going through one shape or form early in development and then changing into another later in development. Organisms also show activity in rest and activity cycles. Organisms typically aren't active all the time. Most organisms are active during only a portion of the day or the year, and they rest during other portions of the day or night or year. And they're usually on a cycle. So some organisms rest in a day-night fashion. There's an herbivorous jellyfish, for example. There's a jellyfish that lives in lakes in South America that during the night they will go down deep in the lake where it is very dark and where they're away from anything that might find them and eat them. During the day, they come up to the surface. And they come up to the surface because inside their bodies are mutualistically living one-celled organisms that can produce food from light. There's algae that live in the bodies of these jellyfish. And so the jellyfish move to the surface near the sunlight so that those one-celled organisms, those algal organisms, can produce food for the jellyfish and for themselves. And then at night, again, the jellyfish go into the deep water. So they're moving up and down in the water column on a day-night cycle. And you're probably familiar with bats that are inactive usually during the day, flying at night to find and consume their food, and then going back into the cave to rest for the night. There are other organisms that switch that. They sleep at night and are active during the day. And then there are organisms that alternate between activity and rest on a seasonal basis. Probably most famously, we have the bears that sleep for much of the winter and then are active during the summer and spring and fall. But we also have similar kinds of things with bats. There are some bats that, in fact, migrate to another location. In the place where I lived for a number of years in Tennessee, there's the two most common species of bats. There's a large species and a small species. The large species would migrate in the winter, go down to South America, and come back for the summer and live in Tennessee. There's the smaller species of bats, however, it went in the winter, hibernated in the caves. They never left that particular area. They just slept through the winter and then came out again in the summer. And there are many examples of organisms that seasonally move between rest and activity.